The Galactic Conclave had convened 11 emergency sessions in the past decade. Wars, supernovae, the collapse of the Red Hari trade routes, all had warranted the great assembled chamber to fill with the trembling voices of 300 civilizations. None of those sessions had been called because of a human infant. Ambassador Kale of the Vorith Dominion had lived for 240 years. He had witnessed the birth of stars. He had watched empires fold like wet paper. He had stood at the edge of a dying planet and felt nothing more than professional detachment. He had never, in all that time, been afraid of something that weighed 9 pounds. The child sat on the floor of Docking Bay 7 aboard the Conclave Station Eternal Meridian, surrounded by what could only be described as wreckage. 3 nutritional dispensers lay overturned. A data tablet, rated for military-grade impact resistance, had been reduced to a plastic crescent. A thick ring of drool had pooled on the station's polished floor with a kind of casual authority. The human called Sarah knelt beside the child, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her expression one of profound, weaponized calm. "He's teething," she said, when she noticed Kale standing in the doorway with 4 of his secondary arms folded against his thorax in the universal posture of "I did not prepare for this." "You brought a larval human onto a diplomatic station," Kale said, his translator clicking between frequencies. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like a man reading aloud from a disaster report. "I brought my son," Sarah corrected pleasantly. "His name is Milo." Milo looked up at Kale with enormous brown eyes. Kale took a step backward. The problem, and the Conclave's security director, a 4-armed Gasali named Vreen, had been awake for 31 hours considering the nature of this problem, was that the child should not have been able to do what he had done. The first incident had occurred during the welcoming banquet. Milo, secured in what the human called a carrier strapped to Sarah's chest, had reached out with one small fist and grabbed the ceremonial sash of High Delegate Roamin of the Tessari hegemony. The High Delegate, whose people communicated primarily through bioluminescent color shifts across their translucent skin, had immediately cycled through 17 distinct hues in less than 3 seconds, a sequence later analyzed by linguists as the approximate Tessari equivalent of "I am being consumed, I am being consumed, I am being consumed." Sarah had simply detached the tiny fingers with practiced ease and murmured, "No, Milo, that's not yours." The Tessari delegate had not fully recovered her composure for 6 hours. The second incident had been worse. Ambassador Doric of the Kreth, a species whose warrior caste was known to wear the skulls of their enemies as aesthetic ornamentation, a species that had never in recorded history used the word frightened without irony, had rounded a corridor corner and come face to face with the crawling human larva. Milo had stopped. Doric had stopped. Milo had smiled. It was the smile, the Kreth delegation's psychological attaché later wrote in his incident report, that had done it. Not the small flat teeth. Not the disproportionate head or the pudgy appendages. The smile. An expression that communicated, in some primal trans-species frequency, "I have decided that you are interesting, and I have not yet decided what to do about that." Doric had pressed himself against the wall and allowed the child to pass. He told no one. He told everyone within the hour. Kale found Sarah in the station's observation lounge the following morning, Milo balanced on her knee, the two of them watching the slow rotation of a distant nebula. The child was gnawing on what appeared to be a synthetic bone designed for a creature much larger than him. He was winning. "How did he get out of the quarters?" Kale asked, settling into the seat beside her with the careful dignity of someone who had decided to be calm about this. "He learned to open the door," Sarah said. "He is 8 months old. 8.5. She tilted her head. "He's advanced for his age." Kale looked at the child. The child looked back at Kale with that same unsettling curiosity, the gaze of something cataloging the universe and finding it satisfactory so far. "Your people," Kale said carefully, "are listed in the Conclave Xenobiological Registry as a Class 4 sentient species. Relatively fragile. High emotional dependency in early development. Long maturation period." He paused. "The registry notes that human young are, for their first several years, completely dependent on adult caregivers for survival." "That's true," Sarah agreed. And yet the Tessari High Delegate submitted a formal request this morning asking that the child be confined to quarters during all diplomatic sessions. Also reasonable. And Ambassador Doric of the Creth, Sarah, has asked whether the child is available for a brief ceremonial audience at his delegation's convenience. Sarah smiled. He left a gift outside our door this morning. A carved bone. Milo's been chewing on it for an hour. Kale stared at the object in the child's hands. He had assumed it was synthetic. It was not synthetic. It was, in fact, the tusk of a Velthari war beast, which was the Creth's most traditional gesture of respect toward a creature they considered a worthy rival. He was quiet for a long time. He said his first word yesterday, Sarah said softly. What was it? She looked at her son. Milo had turned back to the nebula, one hand pressed flat against the viewport, his whole small body focused on the burning colors beyond the glass with an intensity that felt, somehow, like ownership. Papa, she said. He said Papa. Kale processed this. The human male who? He's not here, Sarah said, simply, without bitterness. He's on Earth. It was complicated. She lifted Milo and settled him against her shoulder. The child made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite a growl, something that occupied the frequency between contentment and warning, and buried his face briefly in her neck. But Milo says it to everyone now. To me. To the food dispenser. To the stars. A quiet laugh. He said it to Doric. Kale felt something move through his 240-year-old nervous system. Something cold and electric and very old. Doric allowed it. He stood very still and made a sound like a cooling engine. Sarah smoothed the child's hair. I think it might be the nicest thing that's happened to him in decades. The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave was not, technically, about the child. It was about the clause in the station's hosting treaty that had never been properly examined, the one requiring all visiting delegations to submit full biological safety profiles for any organisms brought aboard, including, as it turned out, human infants. No one had ever submitted a profile for a human infant. It was, in the estimation of the Conclave's legal division, the most significant oversight in the station's 400-year history. The session was also, informally, about the fact that 3 delegations had now requested extended meetings with the human representative specifically to interact with her offspring. The Creth had sent a second gift. The Yulhari Collective had offered, through careful diplomatic language, what amounted to a formal adoption inquiry, which Sarah had declined with equal diplomacy and a warm smile. Kale presented the legal situation to the chamber. He was thorough and precise. He covered the treaty language, the regulatory gaps, the precedent implications. He did not mention that Milo had crawled into his secondary workstation that morning and fallen asleep on top of his diplomatic correspondence, and that he had, after a long moment of standing very still, draped his outer robe over the child and let him sleep. He did not mention that when the child had woken, looked up at him, and said, Papa, with a cheerful certainty that brooked no argument. Something inside him had simply accepted it. He did not mention that he was, at this very moment, functioning as the child's designated caretaker while Sarah addressed the chamber, because 3 other ambassadors had volunteered for the role, and he had gotten there first. Milo sat in Kale's secondary arms, investigating one of his communication nodes with profound scientific interest. The galaxy, in its great and humbling way, watched a 240-year-old warrior diplomat hold a 9-pound human larva like something precious. And the child, unbothered by the weight of 300 civilizations watching him, reached up and patted Kale on the jaw with one open hand. Papa, he said. The chamber was silent. Kale, ambassador of the Vorith Dominion, survivor of wars and supernovae, looked down at the small, impossible creature in his arms. Yes, he said quietly. I suppose so. The galaxy did not stop, exactly. It simply held its breath for a moment, the way all things do when they realize something has changed forever, gently, irrevocably, without asking anyone's permission. The way humans always seem to manage it.